March 9th, 1945. 17 minutes past midnight. Major General Toroshiro Kawabe stood at the window of his office in the War Ministry building, 3 stories above Ichigaya, watching searchlights sweep the darkness over Tokyo. The air raid sirens had begun their wail 11 minutes earlier, their mechanical screams echoing through streets that had heard them before, but never quite like this. Kawabe was chief of the Army General Staff's Operations Bureau. He'd spent 32 years preparing for war, studying at the finest military academies, analyzing campaigns from Napoleon to the Great War. He understood logistics, tactics, the mathematics of attrition. He'd helped plan the invasion of Manchuria, the drive into China, the lightning strikes across the Pacific in 1941 and 42. Nothing in that preparation had equipped him for what was about to unfold. The first indication came at 12:21. His aide, a young captain named Suzuki, burst through the door, his face pale in the harsh electric light. "Sir, observation posts are reporting something unusual. The B-29s are coming in low, very low." Kawabe turned from the window. His first thought was tactical confusion. The Americans had spent months perfecting high-altitude bombing, staying at 30,000 feet where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them, where the thin air made interception nearly impossible. Flying low contradicted everything they'd learned about American doctrine. How low? 5,000 to 7,000 feet, sir. The reports are coming from multiple posts, and there are dozens of them, maybe more than 100. Not the familiar white flashes of high-explosive bombs, but thousands of small fires blooming across the Shitamachi district like deadly flowers scattered by an invisible hand. The working-class neighborhoods east of the Sumida River, where wooden houses pressed against each other in dense warrens, where nearly 1 million people slept. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By 12:30, the fires had merged. Kawabe could feel the heat through the glass, though the inferno was miles away. The wind that night was blowing at nearly 30 miles per hour, driving the flames through narrow streets faster than people could run. The phone on his desk rang constantly. Reports from fire brigades, police stations, military posts, each one more desperate than the last. The fires were creating their own weather system, generating winds so powerful they were tearing people off their feet and hurling them into the flames. At the Imperial Palace, barely 2 miles from the War Ministry, Emperor Hirohito had been awakened by his chamberlain at midnight. The emperor, 44 years old, slight of build, accustomed to ritual and ceremony, stood at the window of his private quarters, watching the eastern sky turn orange. He said nothing for several minutes. Behind him, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Koichi Kido waited, uncertain whether to speak. "How many aircraft?" the Emperor finally asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, but Kido noticed his hands trembling. "The reports are still coming in, Your Majesty. Intelligence estimates at least 200 bombers, possibly more." Hirohito had studied military science since childhood. He understood what incendiaries meant when dropped on a city where 90% of structures were wood. He understood what hundreds of bombers could do in a single night. He understood that this was different from the raids that had come before. "Summon the War Council," he said. "I want to know what is happening, all of it." But the War Council couldn't assemble. War Minister General Korechika Anami was at his residence in western Tokyo, cut off by spreading fires. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai was trapped at the Navy Ministry building. Chief of the Army General Staff, Yoshihiro Umethu, was at Imperial General Headquarters, receiving fragmentary reports that contradicted each other. Some said the fires were under control. Others said entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. At 1:17 in the morning, Kawabe received a call from the commander of the 1st Anti-Aircraft Division. The man was shouting to be heard over the roar of flames in the background. "We can't stop them. They're too low, and there are too many. Our guns can't traverse fast enough. The fires are..." The line went dead. Kawabe stood with the receiver in his hand, listening to empty static, understanding that something fundamental had changed. The B-29s kept coming. They flew in streams, one after another, each dropping clusters of M-69 incendiary bombs, 6-pound cylinders, filled with napalm, that burst into white-hot flames on impact. Each bomber carried 40 clusters. Each cluster held 38 bomblets. 334 bombers, each dropping more than 1,500 individual firebombs. 500,000 separate fires ignited across 16 square miles of the most densely populated urban area on Earth. Major Yoshitaka Hori was on duty that night in the underground command center at Imperial General Headquarters. He watched the reports accumulate on the situation map. Red pins for fires, black pins for destroyed fire stations, white pins for hospitals overwhelmed with casualties. By 2 a.m, there were so many pins the map was barely visible beneath them. "Get me casualty estimates," he ordered a subordinate. The young lieutenant looked at him helplessly, his hands shaking as he consulted his notes. "Sir, the police can't reach most of the affected areas. The fires are still burning. The bridges across the Sumida are jammed with people trying to escape. Some of the bridges have collapsed from the heat. We have reports of people jumping into the river," and he paused, his voice breaking, slightly boiling to death. "The water itself is heating up." He'd walked through the ruins of Nanking. But this was different. This was Tokyo, his city, the heart of the empire. "Give me your best estimate. Based on population density in the affected areas and the percentage of structures destroyed," the lieutenant replied quietly, "tens of thousands dead, sir. Maybe more. Maybe many more." At 3:32 in the morning, the last B-29 departed. The fires burned on. They would burn for 4 more days. As dawn broke on March 10th, General Anami finally reached the War Ministry. He'd walked the last 3 miles because the roads were impassable, clogged with refugees, fire equipment, military vehicles trying to move through chaos. His uniform was covered in ash. His face was streaked with soot and sweat. He found Kawabe still standing at the window, still watching smoke rise from the ruins, columns of it reaching thousands of feet into the morning sky. "Show me," Anami said. They drove east in a military car, as close as the fires would allow. At the edge of the burned zone, Anami got out and walked forward. The heat was still intense enough to make breathing difficult, a physical pressure against the lungs. Most were burned beyond recognition, charred shapes that had once been human beings, now reduced to twisted carbon. Some had been caught in the open and were now black silhouettes against grey ash. Others had sought shelter in canals and water tanks where they'd been boiled alive, their skin peeling away in sheets. Still others had been asphyxiated by the smoke before the flames reached them, and these looked almost peaceful, as if sleeping, except for their blue lips and the way their hands clutched at their throats. Anami, who had commanded troops in some of the worst fighting in China and Manchuria, who had seen cities burn and civilians die, who had built a reputation for stoicism and emotional control, stood in the ruins of Tokyo and wept. Not openly, not dramatically, just tears running down his ash-stained face as he surveyed the destruction. Kawabe, standing beside him, consulted the latest reports. "We don't know yet, sir. The fires are still too intense to conduct proper searches. But based on the population density of the Shitamachi district and the extent of the destruction, 80,000 at minimum," Kawabe said. "Possibly more than 100,000. 100,000 dead in a single night. More than Hiroshima would kill 5 months later. 14 lost, sir. Out of more than 300, 14, less than 5%. The Americans had traded 14 aircraft, and perhaps 140 crewmen for 100,000 Japanese civilians." The War Council finally convened at noon on March 10th in an emergency session at the Imperial Palace. They met in an underground bunker, though the fires were miles away now. Emperor Hirohito attended personally, which was unusual. Normally he remained silent during these meetings, a symbolic presence, while his ministers debated. Today, he spoke first. "Explain to me what happened last night." General Umesu, chief of the Army General Staff, stood to brief. He was 62 years old, a career military man who had spent 40 years preparing for war. Nothing in that preparation had equipped him for this. Your Majesty, at approximately 11:50, American B-29 bombers began attacking Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The attack lasted approximately 2.5 hours. The bombers flew at unusually low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, which reduced the effectiveness of our anti-aircraft defenses. They dropped 69 incendiary cluster bombs designed to start fires in wooden structures. The bombs were highly effective. Strong winds that night, gusting to 30 miles per hour, spread the fires rapidly through the Shitamachi district. The fires merged into what meteorologists would later term a firestorm, a self-sustaining conflagration that generated its own windstorms. Casualties, the Emperor asked. His voice remained steady, but everyone in the room could hear the weight beneath it, still being assessed. Your Majesty, preliminary estimates suggest tens of thousands dead, possibly exceeding 100,000. Perhaps as many as 1 million people are now homeless. Navy Minister Joe Nye, who had opposed the war from the beginning, stared at his hands. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso looked as if he might be sick. War Minister Anami stood rigid, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the wall. And our response, the Emperor continued. Umesu glanced at Anami, who stepped forward. Your Majesty, we shot down 14 enemy bombers. Our night fighter units engaged where possible, but the Americans attacked in a concentrated stream that overwhelmed our defenses. Our anti-aircraft guns were effective at low altitude in some sectors, but there were simply too many targets. The wind created a firestorm effect that made firefighting impossible in many areas. 14 aircraft, the Emperor said quietly. Out of how many? Intelligence estimates 334 bombers participated in the raid, Your Majesty. The Emperor looked at Anami directly. His gaze was steady, penetrating. General, I want you to understand what I'm asking. The Americans lost 14 aircraft to kill 100,000 of my subjects and destroy 16 square miles of my capital. The Emperor was asking whether Japan could survive a sustained campaign of such raids, whether the war was still winnable, whether continuing to fight made any strategic sense at all. It was a question that cut through all the rhetoric about spirit and sacrifice, all the propaganda about inevitable victory. It demanded an honest answer, and honest answers were dangerous things in Tokyo in March of 1945. Your Majesty, Anami began carefully, measuring each word. The Americans have approximately 500 B-29 bombers in the Marianas. Our air defenses are inadequate against mass low-altitude incendiary raids. Our fighter strength is depleted. We lack the fuel and pilots to mount effective interceptions. And our cities, as Your Majesty knows, are particularly vulnerable to fire. Then we must evacuate the cities, Prime Minister Koiso said. Move the population to the countryside. Disperse the industrial facilities. It was a suggestion born of desperation, and everyone in the room knew it. General Umesu shook his head. Evacuate 12 million people from the major cities? With what transportation? To where? And how would we feed them? Our rice production is already insufficient. Moving millions more people into agricultural areas would create mass starvation. Then what do you propose? Koiso demanded. His voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through diplomatic control. The question hung in the air. What could they propose? The Americans controlled the seas around Japan. They controlled the skies above Japan. They could burn Japanese cities at will, and there was nothing the imperial military could do to stop them. Nothing in 40 years of military planning had prepared them for an enemy with such overwhelming industrial capacity, such technological superiority, such willingness to use it without restraint. Admiral Yonai spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the tension in the room. Last night's raid was not an isolated incident. It was a demonstration of capability. The Americans have shown us that they can destroy our cities whenever they choose. They have shown us that our defenses cannot stop them. And they have shown us that they are willing to use this capability without restraint. He paused, looking around the table at faces he'd known for decades, men he'd served with, argued with, planned with. The question is whether we can achieve any of our war aims before they burn every city in Japan to the ground. We fight on, Anami said firmly. His voice carried the weight of conviction, of a lifetime, spent in service to the emperor and the nation. We make them pay for every foot of Japanese soil. We make the cost of invasion so high that they will negotiate rather than continue. Last night was terrible, yes, but the Japanese people are strong. They will endure. They will sacrifice. And when the Americans finally attempt to land troops on our shores, we will destroy them on the beaches. We will fight with the courage of our ancestors. We will show them that the spirit of Japan cannot be broken by fire. With what forces? Yonai asked quietly. The question was simple, direct, devastating. Our best divisions are scattered across the Pacific, cut off and starving. Our navy barely exists. Our air force is reduced to training pilots in obsolete aircraft for kamikaze missions. And now our cities are burning. What exactly will we fight with, General? What weapons? What soldiers? What resources? Anami's face flushed with anger. We fight with the spirit of Yamato. We fight with the courage of the samurai. We fight because surrender is unthinkable. Because our ancestors fought. Because the alternative is national humiliation. Because spirit does not stop incendiary bombs, Yonai interrupted. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. I watched Tokyo burn from the Navy Ministry building. I saw the sky turn orange. I smelled the smoke. I read the casualty reports. Tell me, General, what honor is there in letting our people die for a war we cannot win? What glory is there in watching our cities reduced to ash while we talk about samurai spirit? Anami stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The Navy has no right to speak of honor. His voice was tight with barely controlled rage. You lost the Pacific. You lost our carriers at Midway. You lost our fleet. The army has been fighting and winning for 40 years. And now you want us to surrender because you failed. Gentlemen. Emperor Hirohito's voice cut through the argument like a blade. Both men turned, shocked. The emperor never intervened in these debates. He was supposed to be above them, a symbolic presence. But something had changed in him since midnight. Something had broken or perhaps clarified. Sit down, both of you. They sat. Hirohito looked at each man in turn, his gaze steady, measuring. I have heard these arguments before. They do not change. General Anami believes we must fight on. Admiral Yonai believes we must seek peace. Prime Minister Koiso attempts to find middle ground that does not exist. And while you argue, my people die. He paused, and in that pause the weight of the night settled over the room. I toured areas near the palace this morning, he continued. I saw what the Americans did. I saw the bodies. I saw the survivors searching through ash for anything salvageable. I saw children orphaned, families destroyed, a city reduced to ruins. And I know that this will continue. The Americans will burn every city in Japan if we allow them to. Soon they will have exhausted our major urban centers and will turn to medium cities, then small towns. Your Majesty, Anami began, but Hirohito raised his hand slightly. I am not finished, General. He waited until the room was completely silent. You speak of honor and sacrifice. You speak of the decisive battle. But I have seen enough death. I have seen enough sacrifice. And I wonder whether continuing this war serves Japan or merely serves our pride. The room was utterly silent. No one moved. No one breathed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. I do not order you to surrender, Hirohito said carefully. Not yet. But I order you to think carefully about what you are asking the Japanese people to endure. And I order you to remember that your duty is not to preserve your honor, but to preserve Japan. The meeting adjourned without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted. The emperor had spoken more directly than ever before about ending the war. Everyone in that room understood what it meant. On March 18th, 8 days after the raid, Emperor Hirohito toaded the destroyed areas of Tokyo. His motorcade drove through streets lined with ash and rubble where streets had once been. The fires had finally burned out, but the smell of death hung heavy in the air, a sweet, sickening odor that penetrated everything. Recovery teams were still pulling bodies from the ruins, stacking them in piles for mass cremation. Survivors wandered through the wreckage, some searching for family members, others simply moving because standing still meant confronting what had been lost. Some looked up as the imperial car passed, recognizing the insignia. Most were too exhausted, too traumatized to react. The emperor's chamberlain, Kido, who accompanied him, later wrote in his diary that His Majesty said nothing during the entire tour. He looked at the ruins, at the survivors, at the recovery teams carrying bodies wrapped in cloth. When we returned to the palace, he went immediately to his private quarters. I heard later that he wept. What the emperor saw that day was the end of the world he had known. The Tokyo of his childhood, of his father's reign, of 1,000 years of imperial tradition, gone, reduced to ash in a single night, and the Americans had barely begun. Between March 10th and the end of May, the B-29s returned, again and again. Nagoya burned on March 11th, when 310 B-29s struck the city. The attack was spread over a larger area than Tokyo but still destroyed over 2 square miles of buildings. Not a single bomber was lost to Japanese defenses. Osaka burned on March 13th when 274 superfortresses attacked and destroyed more than 8 square miles of the city. 2 aircraft were lost. Kobe burned on March 16th when 331 B-29s created a firestorm that destroyed 7 square miles, roughly half the city's total area. 8,000 people died. 650,000 were left homeless. 3 bombers were lost. Nagoya burned again on March 18th. The pattern was established, undeniable, unstoppable. Each raid followed the same formula. Hundreds of bombers, low altitude, incendiaries, tens of thousands dead, and Japan's defenses could do almost nothing to stop them. In the War Ministry, the debates continued. General Anami remained adamant about fighting on, about making the Americans pay such a high price for invasion that they would negotiate rather than continue. But his arguments grew more desperate as the casualty reports mounted. The mathematics of attrition that had always favored Japan in defensive warfare no longer applied when the enemy could simply burn your cities from the air. Major Hori, the staff officer who had been on duty the night of March 10th, attended many of these planning sessions. In his post-war memoir, he wrote with brutal honesty about what he witnessed. By April, we all knew the war was lost. The question was no longer whether we would lose, but how many more Japanese would die before we admitted defeat. General Anami spoke of honor and sacrifice, but when I looked at the casualty reports, I saw only numbers. 80,000 here, 50,000 there. The numbers stopped meaning anything after a while. They were just abstractions, figures on paper. But then I would remember that night, watching the pins accumulate on the map, each one representing hundreds or thousands of people, and I would realize that each number was a person, a mother, a father, a child, and we were letting them die for a war we knew we could not win. General Kawabe, the intelligence chief who had watched the first fires from his window, reached his own conclusions by mid-April. He began compiling a report for the War Council, a document that would become infamous in post-war analysis for its unflinching assessment of Japan's position. The report was titled, Assessment of American Strategic Bombing, Capability and Implications for Continued Resistance. It ran to 37 pages, filled with statistics, projections, comparisons, but its essence could be summarized in a single paragraph. The Americans have demonstrated the ability to destroy Japanese cities at will. Our air defenses are inadequate and growing weaker as fuel and aircraft become scarce. Civilian morale is deteriorating rapidly. Industrial production is collapsing. The Americans show no sign of stopping or reducing the intensity of attacks. Continued resistance will result in the complete destruction of Japan's urban centers and the deaths of millions of civilians, without any realistic prospect of achieving favorable peace terms. When Kawabe presented the report to General Umesu in late April, the Chief of Staff read it in silence, his face expressionless. When he finished, he looked up. "You are recommending surrender. I am recommending that we face reality, sir," Kawabe replied carefully. "The Americans did this with less than 500 bombers in 2 hours. They have shown us what they can do. They will continue to do it, and we cannot stop them." Umesu set the report down, his hands flat on the desk. "The army will not accept surrender. You know this." Many of the younger officers would rather see Japan destroyed than admit defeat. Some are already talking about a coup if the government attempts to surrender. "Then Japan will be destroyed," Kawabe said quietly. "Because the Americans will not stop. They have the capability and the will to burn every city in Japan. And after the cities are gone, they will burn the towns. And after the towns are gone, they will burn the villages. And when there is nothing left to burn, they will invade, and millions more will die fighting a battle we cannot win." Umesu stared at the report for a long moment, his jaw working. "I will present this to the War Council. Sometimes it is easier to continue fighting than to admit you have lost." The War Council met again on May 8th. Germany had surrendered the day before, ending the war in Europe. Now the full weight of Allied military power would turn toward Japan. The implications were obvious, unavoidable, terrifying. "Gentlemen," Prime Minister Koiso began, his voice weary, "we must discuss our strategic position in light of recent developments. With Germany's surrender, our position is clear," Anami interrupted. His voice carried the weight of conviction, of a lifetime spent in military service. "We fight on. We prepare for the decisive battle when the Americans attempt to invade the home islands. We mobilize every able-bodied citizen. We turn Japan into a fortress. We make them pay such a price that they will negotiate rather than continue." "And how many Japanese will die in this decisive battle?" Admiral Yonai asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room. "As many as necessary," Anami replied, without hesitation. "The alternative is surrender, which is unthinkable." "Is it?" Yonai leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. "General, since March 10th, the Americans have killed more than 250,000 civilians in air raids. They have destroyed 67 cities. They have made millions of our people homeless. They have crippled our industrial capacity. And they have done all of this while losing fewer than 500 aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." "These are facts," Yonai continued, his voice steady. "Undeniable facts. Now you propose that we continue fighting until they invade, at which point we will fight a battle that will kill millions. More Japanese. For what? What do we gain? What do we achieve except more death?" "We preserve our honor," Anami said firmly. "Honor." Yonai's voice rose slightly, the first time anyone in the room had heard him raise his voice. "I watched Tokyo burn from the Navy Ministry building. I saw the sky turn orange. I smelled the smoke. I read the casualty reports. Tell me, General, what honor is there in letting our people die for a war we cannot win?" The two men stared at each other across the table, the argument that had been building for months finally breaking into the open. The room held its breath. Anami stood abruptly. "The Navy has no right, gentlemen." Emperor Hirohito's voice again, cutting through the tension. Both men fell silent immediately. "Sit down. Both of you." They sat. The Emperor looked around the table, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "I have heard these arguments many times. They do not change, and they do not help. General Anami believes we must fight on. Admiral Yonai believes we must seek peace. And while you argue, my cities burn and my people die." He paused, and in that pause they could hear the clock ticking on the wall, marking seconds that felt like hours. I toured Tokyo, he said quietly. I saw what remains. I spoke with survivors. I understand what has been done to my capital and my people. And I know that the Americans will continue until there is nothing left to burn. Your Majesty, Anami began, his voice softer now. If we surrender unconditionally, I am not finished, General. Hirohito's tone remained gentle, but beneath it was steel that no one in that room had heard before. You speak of honor and the decisive battle. You speak of mobilizing the nation for a final stand. But I have seen enough. I have seen what this war is doing to Japan, and I wonder if continued resistance serves our nation or merely serves our pride. The room was silent. No one dared speak. I do not order you to surrender, Hirohito said. Not today. But I order you to prepare plans for both scenarios. Plans for the decisive battle General Anami envisions, and plans for ending the war on terms that preserve what remains of Japan. Because I will not watch this country burn to ash while we debate honor. But everyone understood that something irreversible had happened. The Emperor had not merely spoken. He had taken a position. In the weeks that followed, the firebombing continued. Tokyo was struck again on May 25th, when 464 B-29 Segundo returned to finish what they'd started. The raid destroyed another 11 square miles, killed more than 3,000 people, and left another 500,000 homeless. The main building of the Imperial Palace, including the liaison conference room where the War Council met, was severely damaged. The Emperor and his family were forced to move to a bunker beneath the palace grounds. By the end of May, every major city in Japan except Kyoto had been attacked. More than 250,000 civilians were dead. Millions were homeless. The industrial capacity that remained after years of naval blockade was being systematically destroyed, factory by factory, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city. And still, the War Council debated. Still General Anami argued for fighting on, for the decisive battle, for making the Americans pay such a price that they would negotiate. Still Admiral Yonai pushed for seeking peace while something remained to save. On the night of March 9th, standing at his window watching the first fires bloom over Tokyo, General Kawabe had understood immediately what was happening. This was not just another air raid. This was the beginning of the end. The Americans had found a way to destroy Japan without ever landing a soldier on Japanese soil. They would burn the cities, kill the civilians, break the will to resist, and there was nothing the imperial military could do to stop them. Now, 2 months later, with dozens of cities destroyed and hundreds of thousands dead, the rest of Japan's leadership was finally reaching the same conclusion. The war was lost. The only question was how many more would die before they admitted it. General Anami would never admit it. He would argue for continued resistance until the very end. On August 15th, after the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, Anami would commit ritual suicide rather than accept defeat. His final words would be an apology to the Emperor for failing to achieve victory. But on that night in March, watching Tokyo burn, some part of him must have known. The firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of his capital in a single night was not just destroying buildings and killing civilians. It was destroying the illusion that Japan could still win this war. It was destroying the belief that spirit and sacrifice could overcome industrial might and technological superiority. It was destroying the world that men like Anami had built their entire lives around. The fires burned for 4 days after March 10th. The debate in the War Council would burn for 5 more months, and in the end, it would take 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria to finally force the decision that should have been made on March 10th. But on that night, standing in the ruins of Tokyo, watching recovery teams pull bodies from the ash, General Anami had wept. Not for the dead, though they numbered in the tens of thousands. Not for the city, though it lay in ruins. But for Japan itself, and for the future he could see coming but could not accept. The Americans had shown them what industrial warfare looked like in the 20th century. They had shown them what happened when you fought an enemy with unlimited resources, unmatched technology, and no restraint in using both. They had shown them that courage and honor and sacrifice meant nothing against napalm and white phosphorus dropped from 7,000 feet by bombers that could return night after night, wave after wave, until nothing remained but ash. And Japan's high command, standing in the ashes of their capital, finally understood what they had done. They had started a war they could not win. They had continued a war they could not win. And now their people were paying the price for that hubris in blood and fire. The question was no longer whether Japan would lose. The question was how many more nights like March 9th the country would endure before its leaders found the courage to admit defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.